When my elder sister was in middle school, she often had to walk home after class. Her school was down in the valley, and her house was up in the mountains, a journey that became particularly eerie as night began to fall. On this specific evening, the sky was already dimming as she and two friends approached the last stretch of the path. Just beyond a ridge, past a fork in the road, their home waited. But they hadn't reached safety yet. As they approached the fork, something caught their attention. A strange sight between the path and the mouth of a small cave nearby. A girl was kneeling there, her body rigid and trembling. My sister recognized her immediately. A quiet girl from the same school, maybe even the same village. She was never one to mingle or draw attention, and now here she was, furiously slapping herself across the face. Over and over, her hands made sharp, echoing cracks against her cheeks. Her lips moved constantly, mumbling words my sister couldn't make out. Her expression was blank, almost mechanical, as though she weren't fully there. The three girls froze in their tracks. "Hey, are you okay?" they called out. They shouted her name over and over, but she didn't respond. It was as if she couldn't hear them, or worse, didn't care. The sound of flesh hitting flesh and her low, guttural murmurs were the only response. Fear set in. None of them dared to approach her. After a hurried debate, one of them decided to run back to the village to fetch help. The others stayed behind, too scared to leave, yet too terrified to get closer. The minutes felt like hours, but soon the sound of hurried footsteps signaled the arrival of several adults. The adults tried everything. They shook her shoulders, shouted her name, even splashed cold water on her face. Nothing worked. She remained kneeling, slapping herself raw, her muttering growing more frantic, her voice hoarse and strained. Then someone suggested they call for a local man who was known for handling such unclean matters. When the man arrived, he carried with him a strange assortment of tools, amulets, incense, and other objects the girls couldn't identify. He performed a ritual right there, chanting and waving the items around her, as if trying to break through an invisible barrier. Gradually, her movements slowed. Her hands stopped mid-slap, trembling in the air. Then she collapsed, unconscious, into the dirt. When she woke, her face was swollen and red, her lips cracked from muttering. She didn't seem to know where she was or what had happened. Her parents hurried her home, but something about her was off. The girl who returned wasn't the same one who'd gone to school that morning. Word spread quickly. People whispered about what had happened at the fork in the road. It didn't take long for someone to connect the spot to a dark piece of local history. That exact place was where a mass grave lay, an unmarked site where desperate refugees had been buried after starving to death during a famine long ago. Superstitions held that the place was cursed, a vortex of bad energy. Travelers avoided it at night, claiming to have seen shapes moving in the dark, heard whispers, or felt unseen hands brush against them. For the girl, life unraveled. She stopped attending school, her once sharp mind dulled and scattered. She wandered aimlessly, often staring into nothing for hours. Over time, she became a shadow of herself, consumed by fear and despair. Her family tried to help, but nothing worked. And then, a few years later, she burned to death. She had locked herself inside her home and set it on fire. Some said it was an accident. Others insisted it was deliberate. But those who knew her whispered in hushed voices her torment wasn't of this world. To this day, people avoid that fork in the road after sunset. Even the bravest claim to feel a chill in the air, a weight on their chest, as if the forgotten souls buried there still linger, waiting for someone to notice their pain. This story still gives me chills every time I think about it. It's true. I swear it happened in my village. A man in his 50s went up the mountain one afternoon to dig for bamboo shoots. He was a seasoned gatherer, used to the tough terrain, but by evening he hadn't come home. His family started to worry and called his phone. When he finally picked up, his voice was shaky. He said he was by a small creek but couldn't find his way out, no matter how much he tried. He sounded lost, confused, almost desperate. Then the line went dead. They tried calling him again and again, but his phone wouldn't connect. Terrified, the family called the police. The rescue team arrived and used satellite tracking to locate his phone. But something wasn't right. The The coordinates showed he was several kilometers away from the creek he had described. It made no sense. Still, they searched all night, combing through the dense forest with flashlights and calling his name. The mountains swallowed their voices. There was no sign of him. The next morning, exhausted and desperate, his family went back up the mountain. That's when they found him, his body lying on a steep ledge, a place so high and treacherous that even the young and strong would struggle to climb it. But somehow, he had managed to get there, carrying a heavy load of bamboo shoots and tools that easily weighed dozens of kilograms. And then, there was the ground. The tall grass in the area, thick, waist-high, was flattened in a wide, chaotic patch, as if there had been a violent struggle. It looked like he had been fighting with something, rolling and thrashing around, but no one could explain what. There were no signs of animals, no clear cause for what had happened. To this day, no one knows how he got there or what unfolded on that mountain. The locals avoid the area now, speaking of it only in hushed whispers. They say the mountain isn't just a place for bamboo shoots. It hides things we aren't meant to see, things that lure you in and never let you go. This is a story told by the elders, one that sends shivers down your spine. Back in the old days, in a small village, there was a vegetable farmer who would rise long before dawn to push his cart to the town market. One early morning, as he made his way along the familiar path, he noticed something unusual. Ahead of him, the path was bustling with people, moving back and forth as though a market had sprung up overnight. He thought to himself, "I haven't been out in a few days. When did they start an early market here? Well, no matter. More people mean I'll sell all my vegetables quickly." With that, he set up his stall, laying out his vegetables neatly. Before long, a crowd had gathered around him. The customers moved quickly, buying everything he had within the time it took to finish a cigarette. He didn't think twice. He was just happy to have sold everything so fast. Feeling satisfied, he packed up and returned home just as the first light of dawn was breaking. Exhausted, he collapsed into bed and slept until noon. When he woke, he eagerly sat down to count the money he had made. But when he opened his bag, his heart dropped. It wasn't money. It was all hell notes, paper offerings meant for the dead. Anger and confusion overwhelmed him. Who had played such a cruel joke on him? Furious, he grabbed his things and stormed back to the spot where the market had been. But when he arrived, his blood ran cold. There was no market. There never had been. Instead, the area was a graveyard. Each grave was untouched, except for one chilling detail. On top of every grave, there was a neatly placed bundle of fresh vegetables, the same ones he had sold that morning. The man never walked that road again. When I was in my second year of middle school, during a hot summer break, my dad, who worked at a school, let my cousin and me sleep in his office. The school was holding summer classes, and my cousin was attending one of them. My dad wanted him to be comfortable, so he let us use the office for the night. One evening in August, after my cousin finished his class around 10 p.m., we washed up and got ready for bed. My cousin went to close the window, but after a few seconds, he froze. He stood there, staring out the window, not moving. Then he waved his hand at me, signaling for me to come and see. Curious and slightly uneasy, I got up and walked over. I followed his gaze outside toward the boys' dormitory. In the dim light of a nearby street lamp, on top of a cement ping-pong table, stood a figure. It was a person wearing a long white dress. The lighting wasn't great, but it was enough to see clearly. The figure had long hair and no visible face. It just stood there, motionless on the table. I glanced at my cousin, and he looked back at me. Neither of us spoke, but we both instinctively turned our heads back to the table. The figure was gone. In the split second we'd looked at each other, it had vanished. The table was completely empty, the eerie glow of the street lamp casting soft shadows across its surface. There was no one there. The area around the table was wide open, nothing to hide behind, nowhere for anyone to disappear to so quickly. It was as if the figure had simply evaporated. The next day, still shaken, I mentioned the incident to an older staff member at the school. His face darkened as he listened. He told me that the dormitory used to be the girls' dorm. Years ago, a female student had hanged herself in one of the rooms. After her death, the dorm was converted into the boys' dormitory, and the room where she died was demolished. The staff member pointed out that the spot where the ping pong table now stood was exactly where that dorm room had been. A chill ran through me as I connected the dots. The figure in the white dress had been standing on the table. If the table hadn't been there, the figure would have been floating in mid-air at the exact height where the girl had hanged herself. To this day, I can't explain what my cousin and I saw, but we both know what we saw was real. That night, something long forgotten had returned, and it had watched us watching it. Here's a chilling true story my cousin experienced when he was about 11 or 12 years old. His school was right next to a steel rolling mill. Late one night, around 11 p.m., he and a few friends decided to sneak into the mill to steal some scrap metal to sell for pocket money. As they crept closer to the factory's outer wall, they suddenly spotted two white figures in the distance. The figures were holding hands and moving together. At first, the boys thought it was the factory's night guards making their rounds, so they ducked into the tall grass, hoping to stay hidden. But something was wrong. Terribly wrong. The figures weren't walking, they were floating, gliding silently through the air toward a pond near the factory wall. Fear gripped them. None of the boys dared to move, their eyes locked on the ghostly shapes until they disappeared by the water's edge. Then, in a panic, they bolted. They ran home without looking back, breathless and terrified. Once inside, they huddled together under a blanket with the TV on, refusing to sleep. The next morning, when their parents asked what had happened, the boys reluctantly spilled their secret. That was when the truth came out. Years earlier, a young couple had drowned themselves in that very pond. To this day, my cousin swears he saw the spirits of the lovers that night. He says he'll never forget the way they floated, hand in hand toward the darkness of the water. This story still sends chills down my spine every time I think about it. It happened one Chinese New Year when the adults were drinking, and we kids were outside in the courtyard, setting off firecrackers. My 5-year-old cousin got tired as the night wore on and started crying, saying he wanted to go to sleep. That's when my uncle, who had been drinking heavily, suddenly grabbed my cousin and started walking toward the window. We were on the 5th floor. Before any of us could process what was happening, my dad, with quick reflexes, lunged forward and grabbed my cousin by the legs just as my uncle reached the window. My uncle's grip slipped and my dad pulled my cousin free, just as my uncle made a throwing motion toward the window, as if he had intended to toss my cousin out. The moment my dad saved my cousin, my uncle's body abruptly convulsed and he fell backward onto the floor. It was horrifying. His arms fell limply to his sides and his head lolled back, his blank, wide-open eyes staring up at the ceiling. He was completely unresponsive, like a puppet with its strings cut. The rest of us froze, terrified. My dad and my younger uncle didn't dare touch him. Instead, they focused on calming my cousin, who was crying hysterically. My uncle lay on the ground, motionless, all night. When he finally woke up the next day, it was almost noon. We asked him if he remembered anything. He just looked confused and said he had no memory of the night before. He claimed the last thing he recalled was everything going pitch black before waking up in his bed. He didn't know if it was the alcohol or something else. But my dad swears by what he saw. He said it wasn't just drunkenness. My uncle's movements, the way his face turned skyward while he tried to throw my cousin out the window, it wasn't natural. It was like he wasn't himself at all. As if something had taken control of him in that moment. To this day, the story haunts everyone who was there. My dad still believes something unexplainable, something dark, had possessed my uncle that night. Since I was a child, I've had the same dream over and over. In the dream, my father is driving a 3-wheeled cart, carrying our whole family. It feels festive, like we're heading to celebrate something. Every time we reach a stretch of particularly muddy dirt road, the wheels start spinning helplessly, unable to gain traction. Black smoke rises from the cart as it struggles. That's when everyone gets off to push the cart. In the countryside, even the women are strong and pitch in. But at that moment, someone always appears, calling for me specifically. "Someone's looking for you," they say. I leave the group and walk alone. I always end up in a village. The people there wear old-fashioned clothes, the kind my grandparents' generation used to wear. An elderly person always steps out of the crowd, pointing toward a mountain in the distance. "They're waiting for you. Go," they urge. Even now, I can vividly picture that mountain. It's shaped like 5 fingers, sharp and steep. Rainbows arch over it, with white clouds drifting across the sky. It's breathtakingly beautiful, a scene so vivid I could draw it perfectly even today. The strange part is, when I was little, I had never seen a mountain before. Yet in the dream, I knew it. I'd climb it every time. At the top, there was always a young woman, dressed in flowing white. She looked to be in her 20s, with a gentle and elegant face. She always kept a little distance from me, watching me with an expression that seemed like she wanted to say something, but couldn't. This dream kept coming back to me throughout my childhood. But the last few times, something changed. I remember it clearly because it was during the last 2 months before my college entrance exams. For the first time, the woman spoke. She looked at me with a strange mixture of sadness and longing, and she said, "Why don't you come find me?" I woke up with a jolt, her words echoing in my mind. After that night, I never had the dream again. I've spent years wondering about it. Why was that dream so vivid? Why did it haunt me for so long? And who was the woman in white waiting for me on that mountain? About a month ago, something strange happened. I've always been a drinker, but recently my doctor gave me some medication and strictly told me to stop drinking. But I couldn't. I have this old classmate, Guobin, who has the same condition as me, except he loves drinking even more. One night, as we were drinking together, we started talking about it. He said, "How can this disease ever get better when we're drinking and taking meds at the same time? Why can't we quit drinking?" Then he added, "I didn't even start drinking until I was 30, but now, at 48, I'm completely hooked." His words made me think of his twin brother, Jian Biao, another classmate of ours. He had died before he even turned 30, drunk, frozen to death one winter night. I asked Gobin, "How did your brother drink himself to death?" He answered flatly, "If he didn't drink, would he have died?" Then he added something that sent a chill down my spine. After he died, I could still see him, my brother. He was always crouched there in the corner of the wall, not on the ground, the corner of the wall. He said no one else in the family could see him, just him. That night I was drunk too, so I didn't press him further. But a few days later, we met up to drink again. The memory of what he said nagged at me, so I brought it up. "What you told me the other night, was that true?" Gobin looked annoyed. "Why would I lie to you? What's the point?" I knew he wasn't the type to make stuff up, but I pushed him anyway. "Couldn't it just be your eyes playing tricks on you?" He shook his head firmly. "No, for months after he died, I saw him, often." The way he said it sent a shiver down my spine. To this day, I can't stop thinking about it.
Thank you for sharing the fear.